15 days left before we cast our votes for the local government elections on the 1st of November 2021. Tonight on ANC News, I am joined by Zizi Kodwa, ANC NEC member and Deputy Minister of State Security. Good evening to you, sir.
Good evening. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Now, in building better communities together, which is the manifesto's theme for 2021, Minister will assist us unpack the ANC's commitment to building safer communities and the measures put in place, to ensure we have a free, fair and safe elections. So let's get into it and talk to the theme, building better communities together. Now, the manifesto speaks to that particularly, and it mentions how these communities will be built. But now, crime and grime is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing as a country during COVID, before COVID, and now as we build up to the elections. I mean, what is the ANC envisaging on doing differently this time around?
Well, thanks, Penny. One of the things we must celebrate as a people and a nation is that we have never failed to hold elections, whether we're talking about local government, provincial and national. When we do so, as a country, while fulfilling our collective aspiration as enshrined in the Constitution of the Republic, which is our supreme law, which among others guarantees that the country will hold elections after a particular period, which is 5 years, and it guarantees the right of citizens that they will participate in those elections, that we are given an expression to the aspiration of the Freedom Charter that the people shall govern. And it's important to make that link between what the aspirations of the Freedom Charter and the content of the Constitution of the Republic, because the Constitution of the Republic is an expression in the main about what the Freedom Charter aspires us to be. The nation, if you look at the preamble of the Freedom Charter, the kind of a nation we seek to build, non-racial, democratic, united. But it also talks about Bill of Rights, which is about a society we seek to live in, about the rights of citizens. So it's important when you debate these issues that in the context of how we have lived up to the spirit of our Constitution, the architecture of our constitutional democracy, we must celebrate some of the things we have made and achieved as a country, notwithstanding the challenges. I mean, the issues about crime, the issues about unemployment, the issues about poverty, these are some of the challenges that the democratic state continues to address, some of whom they've got a contribution to the kind of the safer communities we're talking about, for example, the social ills, the issues about proliferation of drugs, the proliferation of gangsters in a number of communities. There's a bit of a history, for an example, to the existence of some of these social ills such as gangsterism. There's history to that. But I think it's important that you must appreciate that the role of state is to protect and defend the right of citizens, and therefore the freeness of elections is very important. So,
but the concern around, the crime in recent times and just the level of violence, in the country, Minister, your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, one of the issues in creating safer communities, we don't think that by putting a police officer at the door of each household, that will actually eliminate crime, that will eliminate very violent crimes. We think, among others, community mobilization is very important. Strengthening what is called organs of people's power, such as community police forums, is important because that is where I think if you want to talk about fighting crime, fighting issues about social ills, it's important to mobilize around those issues. Because if you talk about the population of South Africa, it's about 57 million people. You're talking about police force. It's not equivalent to each person. And therefore, it's important, as we know we have done in the past, that we must mobilize communities, we must strengthen institutions of the state, such as police, such as law enforcement. And I think over the past period, if you look at our manifesto since 2019, strengthening law enforcement institutions, and the President has done well to strengthen those institutions.
So in terms of that, strengthening law enforcement, one of the biggest concerns as well is, the polarization of communities around issues at our borders. There's just this feeling that foreign nationals do as they please in our country. They can come in, commit crimes undetected. I mean, is this matter been given attention, or how are South Africans, given satisfaction that this is being looked at and it's looked at closely based on the concerns that they're raising, but at the same time we have to remain socially cohesive as a country? How do you strike that balance?
Sometimes the debate is taken to the extreme. Of course, on one hand, the issues about porous borders. There's no debate about it. We do accept, and we're working on that. That's why recently we established what is called the Border Management Agency, which will also strengthen the issues around border management. But we can't use the porousness of our borders as though it's in itself the issues around and our attitudes towards foreign nationals. Crime is crime, whether it's committed by foreign national or somebody from Soweto or somebody from Kukuletu originally. And therefore, we shouldn't look at crimes as though, in terms of their profile, these certain crimes are committed by people or foreign nationals. In reality, is that we must deal with crime as crime. We are dealing with issues of cross-border. We are dealing with issues of border management, the porousness of our borders. And I think you would have noticed that even during COVID, at a time when the country was at level 5, there were a number of measures we put in place to make sure that we control. But we must make a point that to an extent that we put those measures, South Africa must not exist in isolation of a global village. Okay. We're part of a global village. The number of countries that has happened in the north, and many of those countries naturally will come south to South Africa to look for economic opportunities. How do you deal with that is a matter that I think legislatively and the leadership is looking at that.
Temperatures, some might say, are rising on the ground, you know, when it comes to issues of violence and some intimidation around building up to the elections. You've been on the ground. What are your thoughts?
Well, some of the issues are really unnecessarily polarized. Some of them have been politicized unnecessarily. But I think if you were to ask a question differently, broadly about the fairness and the freeness of elections, and some of the isolated incidents, which may be characterized as risks, for an example, the incident in Port Elizabeth, the Somalis and taxi associations, that has got nothing to do with elections. It's not a threat, but that issue can be exploited, given some of the underlying sentiments about foreign nationals. And that is why this morning, talking to the Minister of Police and ourselves, we were able to intervene and meet with stakeholders. We'll continue to go back to Port Elizabeth. I'm just mentioning to Kabeja. I'm mentioning that but one incident. The issues around Mpumalanga, for an example, the issues around the killing of the disgruntlement about selection of candidates, which is intra-party sometimes, where the state may not intervene. But those issues have got a potential risk to undermine and create fear and panic. But overall, we've got an environment in South Africa that we are likely to have free and fair elections, but we need to deal with those risks that may create a panic and create a fear, because the role of the state ultimately is to guarantee citizens that they will participate in a process that can ultimately bring results that are free and fair.
So on the campaign trail, I mean, there's been all sorts of protests across the country, which also, you know, some might say are not necessarily linked to the elections, but it's issues of safe delivery, which ultimately brings it back to the elections. And then there can be some criminal activities, you know, in between. When we talk to that, I mean, it could present a threat to the campaigning and the elections.
To an extent that we are worried about that, it should not suggest that we must undermine a constitutional right of citizens. You must remember our constitutional architecture allows people to protest. But we must differentiate, because when a protest is a genuine protest in terms of the constitution, they're expressing their right. But when it turns violent, when it turns about destruction of property, when it turns about loss of life, it's no longer about exercising the constitutional right. And therefore it becomes something else. That is where the issues about the state, which is why it's important sometimes to educate people when engage in these activities. Of course, because the temperature is quite, as you just mentioned, and there may be people who take advantage of that. And therefore, the issues about the right versus the what undermines, what becomes unconstitutional, is something that where the leadership of the country, including the law enforcement, will have to make a distinction. That's why I make an example about the issue of Port Elizabeth. There's nothing about, Kabeja, there's nothing about exercising a constitutional right when you destroy property, when you ban the taxis, when somebody is killed, when what we saw on TV and this morning. So it's important to make that distinction, but we shouldn't undermine the fact that people have got a right to protest on issues of service delivery, for example, to express their happiness or to express their unhappiness.
Okay, so what sort of measures or safety measures are put in place to secure that, you know, citizens will be able to exercise their right to vote come November 1st? without intimidation?
Well, firstly, we've got an independent electoral commission. And it's important that both as a government and the state, we assure and guarantee that the IEC is independent from political influence. Not only is it guaranteed from in terms of its independence, but also there are systems in place that allows and give life to that, because it can't and then express that allowing its citizens to participate if itself is not allowed space to operate independently. But secondly, it's important that political parties, because you must remember, in terms of the architecture of our constitutional democracy, political parties are the heartbeat of our democracy. They participate. Without political parties, our democracy is empty. And therefore, political parties themselves must commit to certain principles and values. That's why IEC will have something such as electoral code, for an example. Parties must not, there mustn't be political intolerance towards each other. What we saw in the recent few weeks in KZN cannot be allowed. So on the basis that we don't agree politically, it cannot be expressed through violence, through not allowing. There may not be a no-go areas, for an example, for certain parties. Our constitution does not allow that. That's why there are certain values and principles we must all uphold. That's why political parties, time to time, they get reminded, not by the state, not by government, but by the Independent Electoral Commission, which is, in terms of the constitution, has got powers to run free and fair elections.
How is that addressed within the ANC if it's members of the ANC, whether it's in KZN or Gauteng or Mpumalanga? How do you guys tackle
Well, the ANC has got internal mechanisms. There are instances where we have rebuked members, firstly for making very statements that are not in keeping, both with the constitution of the ANC, with the conduct expected of the ANC members, as well as the constitution of the Republic. We have done so. We have had to recall certain people to some form of meetings where they would have made certain statements, that those statements undermine the very same internal democracy, firstly of the ANC. You would have heard, for an example, that there were disgruntled members of the ANC throughout this, through the process of candidate selection. They would have been unhappy about it. Some would have mobilized. They would have gone and done certain things. There are processes in the ANC to deal with those issues. But as we deal with that issues now, we are done with disputes for the purposes of elections now. We will deal, if there are disputes without being investigated, post the first. We want to win elections first. But if there are ANC members, they are the last that we can expect to undermine our constitution of the Republic. Because it is the ANC that, among others, hence I made a reference between the ANC and the Freedom Charter. Because through the Freedom Charter, as the ANC, we were able to influence the architecture of our constitutional democracy. And therefore, ANC members at all times are expected to uphold the values and the principles of a free and fair elections.
How do you address those who say it seems like you might not have control, because if some of these situations resort to violence when it involves members of the ANC? How do you answer to that?
We don't deal with issues of violence as a state, talking on behalf of the state now. We don't deal with issues of violence looking at the paraphernalia of a person or an affiliation. We deal with violence, we deal with crime as crime. Regardless if you are black, green and gold, if you are wearing red, you are wearing blue, we don't care about the looks of a person, how you walk, how you speak. And therefore it's important to make that distinction, that it shouldn't be suggested that we may be soft, we may be reluctant to act because it's an ANC member. If anybody commits a crime, you commit a crime, regardless of a political affiliation, and that is the attitude of the state.
Okay. So if those South Africans who are saying, will we have free and fair elections, can we trust that that's what's going to happen going into these local government elections? What do you say to that?
Well, if you look at these elections in 2016, probably that question would have been more relevant in 2016. Look at what happened in KZN. A lot of killings in KZN happened. If you look at comparatively, and we have to benchmark since 1994, we have relatively had very peaceful elections in South Africa. And we have no reason to doubt that this time around we will not have free and fair elections, given all what has happened. And we shouldn't be confused about some of the isolated incidents we have seen. Some of those isolated incidents have got nothing to do with elections. I've just mentioned one for an example. The Gqeberha incident, it's not about campaigning, nobody was campaigning, there's no political party involved, it's pure criminality. Somebody who walked up, left the car and exchanged and so on. And there are genuine service delivery protests And we shouldn't confuse them as though suggesting that it's not free and fair election. It's part of democracy. Actually, it's a maturation of our democracy. And I think some of the issues that happen, we learn as leaders, those of us who are elected, that when people protest, our responsibility is to help them to resolve their problems.
Okay. Now, for the young people who are going to the elections for the very first time and they're saying, Minister, I'm hearing all that you're saying as a member of the NEC. Why should I be voting come November 1st, especially for the ANC?
I've seen very excited young people. As I crisscross the country, some of them are 18 and above. They are voting for the first time. For them, it's quite historic. They come from a country, some of them, some of the history they learned from school about where this country comes from. And I think the notion that there's youth apathy is a wrong notion in South Africa. There's youth activism in South Africa. They may not be as active like Zizi Kodwa was when he was throwing stones and so on. It's not that age. They're active in one way or another. They're active in sport, they're active in arts, they're active in culture, they're active in religion and so on. That is where youth activism is, and it must not be measured on the basis of our old youth, how they became active in politics. And I think sometimes we do throw this notion to young people that they're apathetic politically. In my view, is that young people are very active. They are they're participating in one way or another, because our society is called building blocks. Part of that building blocks is the issues about social cohesion. Young people participating, and therefore their participation is quite encouraging because they are the future. They must ensure that some of us who are exiting in politics, we do not destroy what has been built before us. So that themselves, they must find this architecture of constitutional framework I spoke about that guarantees their right to participate as citizens, that guarantees their right that they will make sure that they elect a government of their choice, that they will elect a party of their choice, they will elect a party and individuals of their choice. And those values and principles, these are the principles that as they start voting now, they guarantee generations after them that they will find those principles still existing.
So you spoke about the importance of social cohesion, and some will use the incident that just happened in Gqeberha as one that presents a threat to that conversation of social cohesiveness in our country, especially when we're talking about being the kind of country that we are on the rest of the continent, and we're talking to young people who want to connect to the rest of the continent. How do you answer their concerns around their interaction with foreign nationals in our country in the time that we're in right now?
What is important is that we must accept coexistence, firstly, among people of South Africa, of different races, of different creeds, of different religions, as ascribed as articulated very well in the Constitution of the Republic in terms of its preamble. But it's important also to recognize the rights of individuals, that South Africa, the point I made, we're not an island in a sea of a globe. We're part of the global village. But we cannot undermine the fact that there are people who may come to South Africa illegally. That issue, we're dealing with it. But we must not conflate the porous borders with the presence in South Africa of foreign nationals, as though there shouldn't be any foreign nationals in South Africa. That shouldn't be a debate. The debate on one hand should be about how best do we manage the immigration in South Africa of foreign nationals, and how do we coexist with foreign nationals. Even before our freedom, we had foreign nationals. We ourselves were foreign nationals somewhere. We coexisted. So I think it's important that the debate mustn't take two extremes, but I think we should accept one another. But those contradictions you'll find in society, where because of cosmopolitan nature of South Africa, Johannesburg for an example, you'll find all sorts of people. Chinese national, Iranian nationals, they're all in Johannesburg. Cape Town, Durban, these are the metros. The NDP, for an example, in terms of its vision, is that 70% of South Africa's population would be in urban towns. And that is the cosmopolitan nature of South Africa in the next few years to come. How do we coexist and make sure that we build social cohesion without really undermining each other on the basis of their origin?
Okay. Well, they say I must ask you this question again, so I'm going to ask you again. Will South Africa definitely deliver free and fair and safe local government elections and uphold the constitutional mandate?
We have no reason to doubt. I can assure South Africans that on the 1st of... we must remember, elections are not on the day of elections. There's a process towards elections. And it is that process that determines, to answer your question, whether elections are free and fair. Among others, whether political parties are able to to campaign freely, whether individuals themselves as citizens, they are right to participate, select a candidate of their choice, elect a preferred part of their choice, whether they are right are guaranteed, because that is in the Constitution. And therefore it's important that as we do so, we measure what has happened so far. And I can tell you so far, it does indicate for me, it meets the description of the free and fair elections. The actual day itself, I think, is a culmination of a process. So I can assure that South Africans, notwithstanding some of the incidences that themselves must not be defined as a threat to the election, free and fair election itself, but the freeness of the election is paramount to the architecture of our constitutional democracy.
Thank you so much for coming through and chatting
Thank
to
you.
us tonight. There you
I
have
wish
it.
you could go on and go on
I'm
and
sure
go
you
on.
could. 17 days to go before we go to the polls. Thank you for watching this episode of ANC News. Well, catch us again next week for another insightful conversation. From me, Penny Libiani, and the rest of the team, good night.
I'm coming back.
You're coming back.